Welcome back to the Florida History Podcast. I'm Carter Krishnaiyer.
And I'm Robert Buccellato.
So let's talk today a little bit about George Washington, the founder of our country, arguably the greatest American of all time, but his obsession with East Florida, which came to naught. We're going to talk about this over the course of the next several weeks, actually, Robert, next several episodes. And by the way, the founder of the Continental Army, and its 250th anniversary, it's 2025. We're here in May in 2025. And next month, there's going to be a military parade in Washington, D.C., honoring the 250th anniversary, something I never thought I would see in the United States, but we're going to have a military parade. I'm not sure.
So I've heard.
Yeah. So I'm not sure that fits with the tradition of the American Army that was founded.
Margaret Thatcher, yes.
Yeah, that George Washington started. But let's talk about General Washington and Florida. So General Washington was quite concerned in 1775 about the amount of military armaments that were being stockpiled in St. Augustine. And so you had St. Augustine becoming the center of Royal Navy operations in the South, barracks, military staging operations, lots and lots of armaments were stored. It was a place where runaway slaves were fleeing to. So General Washington wrote a letter to the Continental Congress in 1775. He was concerned about the situation with St. Augustine and thought that there needed to be an effort by the Continental Army to invade Florida. So in December 1775, General Washington was formally informed that the British had been stockpiling all this weaponry and ammunition and other materials in St. Augustine. It had been going on since April, really since Lexington and Concord. But Washington, remember, things don't travel, information doesn't travel as fast in those days. Washington is not in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress at this point. He is in Boston, sieging Boston, as we know, in late 1775. So there were two. This was two-pronged. Now, at this point, Washington began to prepare defensive actions in the event that the British launched an invasion of the southern colonies from East Florida. Additional fortifications, as a result, were ordered in Savannah and other smaller outposts, Darien, Georgia, Augusta, Georgia, a few other places. The concern was so great within the political leadership in Philadelphia a few weeks later when Washington wrote to them about this, that they decided they'd rather take offensive action against East Florida than preemptively wait for the inevitable, what seemed like it would be an inevitable British invasion of Georgia. So in January 1776, the Continental Congress authorized the southern colonies attack Florida, East Florida, and capture St. Augustine in order to promote and safeguard the patriot cause. So there was a resolution in Congress that passed that said that, and I quote, that the seizing and securing of the barracks and the castle, by the castle we're talking about the Fort St. Mark, what we know as the Castillo de San Marcos. Castle is an interesting term for it, but it is a fortified fort, right? It's one of the great fortifications in the what is today the United States, right? Castillo de San Marcos. So again, that the seizing and securing of the barracks and castle of St. Augustine will greatly contribute to the safety of the colonies. So, Robert, in early 1776, the British, at the urging, the American Continental Congress, at the urging of General Washington, decides they are going to take offensive action against East Florida and against St. Augustine.
And so what I'm interested in was there ever a point where the Americans ever had enough, because obviously at this point in time, we're not, most of the Continental Congress hasn't even decided to go to war necessarily yet.
Yeah.
There's a few that are talking about independence, but for the most part,
Yeah, this is really early on. We have to stress this.
Yeah. So, yeah. Was there ever a point where America, specifically during the first 2 or 3 years of this situation, where America even had the ability to conquer St. Augustine, let alone keep it. Because we were pretty stretched at that point between both sides of what's happening in Boston and then New York, to say nothing of what was going on here in Florida and Georgia.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it was foolish, but the Congress resolved to do it. They were arrogant. We would see this repeatedly in early American history. The entire War of 1812 was caused by the Congress. By that time, the Congress in Washington, D.C., led by Speaker Henry Clay, who later on would become a beloved and pragmatic figure in American history, but he wasn't so pragmatic in 1811 and 1812. They totally underestimating the strength of the British in Canada and the willingness of the Canadians to fight back. So they make the same miscalculation with Florida over and over again. So they thought that capturing St. Augustine would give the Continental Army direct control over the Castillo de San Marcos and the ability to directly fight against any invading British army coming from the West Indies. It was a serious miscalculation, Robert. Similar to the mistakes that they were making at the very same time in the invasion of Quebec, which, as we know, got defeated on December 31st, 1775. They didn't know that yet. General Richard Montgomery's killed in Quebec City. There's house-to-house fighting, right? And the Americans had captured Montreal. Famously, Gore Vidal writes about this, right? That Aaron Burr carries the dead body of General Montgomery on his back in the retreat. And Benedict Arnold fought valiantly for the Americans. You don't hear much about it anymore. But
at the moment.
Yeah. But at that moment, he was fighting valiantly for the Americans. But they made the same mistakes as they did in the Quebec campaign. There was an assumption that the general population of East Florida would rise up if given the opportunity. They were wrong. St. Augustine by this time was filling up with loyalists and runaway slaves and had all these Native Americans that I've talked about, that I write about in our book that will come out in a few months, Native Americans that had been armed by the British, the Seminoles in particular, but also the Alachua Indians, and there were some other smaller tribes, but the Seminole most prominently, who had been armed by the British and were going to fight on the British side. They were going to fight the Americans. They end up playing a very big role, as we're going to talk about in the next episode, in the defense against some of these invasions. But they completely miscalculated and thought that the population would rise up. And in fact, Continental Congress member John Rutledge, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence later in the year, was sent in early 1776 to oversee the conquest of St. Augustine and the formation of an American government, a patriot government in East Florida. And Rutledge expected to learn when he got there that they had already conquered St. Augustine, which was crazy. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Washington is one of these generals that is, I think everybody would say that he is a great general.
Yeah.
And yet he has one of the worst batting averages of any great general.
At the same time we're talking about here, he's getting beaten in battle after battle on Long Island and Brooklyn Heights, right? And then Fort Washington and Fort Lee, right? They've lost every battle in New York and never regained control of New York City after that.
No, and I think you could probably say that what is happening in Quebec and what is happening here in Florida is a perfect encapsulation of where Washington is right now in his military career. He's not yet Washington. He's still trying to figure everything out. And I think Florida in particular, I think this is very synonymous with how all of the people that were pro-revolution were operating at this time, which was they were just throwing everything at the British. They weren't really thinking things through.
No, they weren't thinking tactically at all.
And as we will talk about in a future video, a future episode, there are several attempts to invade Florida by the Americans, and each one seems to, it's almost as if it's operating off of a learning curve from the last time. And you can sort of,
that describes it to a T.
Yeah, I mean, you could start to see the slow evolution of this ragtag just group of, like Washington, where they were British soldiers. You wouldn't really call it an army, slowly merging into an army and being more practical about their objectives. And so, if you think about it, where they are right now, it makes absolute sense that they would invade Canada. It makes absolute sense that they would try and go into St. Augustine at a time when they couldn't hold on to New York. They couldn't reach Boston. Right.
And so, just to wrap up this episode, and then next week we are going to talk about those actual invasions. General Charles Lee, who was one of the leading commanders in the Continental Army, was tasked with the invasion of East Florida. He dithered because he realized they did not have the manpower to do this. And even if they got to St. Augustine, which, as we'll learn in the next episode, they never did, in spite of many attempts to invade. So he dithered, and, General Charles Lee is a hugely controversial figure in the annals of the American Revolution from the American side. And really, history has not judged him well. But in this case, this specific case, I think he was right. He understood that it would be tough to fight your way to St. Augustine. And if you got to St. Augustine, how the heck are you going to hold the city? How are you going to hold a well-garrisoned city with a population which is largely loyalist? There were some patriots in St. Augustine, quite honestly. We do talk about that in the book. There were some patriots, but mostly was a town of loyalists, and with lots of runaway slaves, with free blacks, which was kind of antithetical to at least the Southern sensibilities, and Catholics and all these different groups. Right? It would have been. It wouldn't have been worth the effort. I mean, in fact, we talk about the American invasion of Quebec a lot. We've talked about a lot of it in this episode. That was a similar thing. I don't know how Montreal was a pretty small place. The Americans did capture Montreal. They did hold Montreal for a period of time. But I do not think they could have ever held Quebec City, even if they had conquered it. Same deal as St. Augustine. So the invasion is called off. Charles Lee is recalled by an apoplectic General Washington, and ends up playing a fairly significant role in the next stanza of the war in New Jersey and Pennsylvania later in 1776 and in early 1777. But at this point, the British realize the Americans are potentially coming, and they fortify even further. Massive forces along the Florida-Georgia border, which at this point is an international border, right, between the newly declared independent United States and the British crown colony of East Florida. So there are British troops amassed along the St. Mary's River. As we get into 1777, yes, the Americans have signed the Declaration of Independence and they declared their independence. The Americans dithering on the invasion, giving the British time to set up, not only, and Lee was right? If they could have invaded and penetrated all the way to St. Augustine, there's no way they would have taken the city. And if they, by accident, taken it, there's no way they could have held it. So he was correct militarily. But now, the British were so prepared to defend Florida that, as we're going to learn in the next episode, Robert, the Americans repeatedly tried to invade over the course of the next several years and never got further than basically, if you know Florida today, never got further than the Nassau County, Duval County line. That's really as far as they got. They got through one county in the modern 67 county. I mean, really, They temporarily conquered portions of Nassau County for a matter of weeks on a few different occasions. That's all they accomplished in East Florida with all this huffing and puffing. But we're going to get more into that next week. We're going to talk about the Battle of Thomas Creek and the intrigue around the British forces in Georgia and the invasion of Florida next week. So join us then.